Welcome everyone to this exciting event that we've been wanting to do for some time and are delighted to be able to do in spite of the pandemic. And it's a really great opportunity for us to listen and learn. My name is Gunther Peck. I'm the director of the Hart Leadership Program, and this is a conversation involving some of the leading Durham activists and actors in the field of criminal justice reform. It will feature several students from the public policy school and some of the work they've done, and also be an opportunity to reflect on what criminal justice reform is at this moment in time. So before we begin, I invite all the participants to mute themselves so that you can have better clarity of hearing, and also to turn off your video so that we can, you're not distracting necessarily. And if you are wanting to ask questions during the event, we are going to be hearing questions through the chat function, and that will be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So it's my pleasure to introduce the person who will be introducing our main participants, Satana Deberry and Ajenai Clemmons. Erin Phillips is a senior in at Duke and in the public policy school, and she also has been an active participant in the 9th Street Journal at the DeWitt Wallace Center. And Erin has also had the opportunity last fall with several of her students to be reporting on the remarkable work of Satana Deberry, our DA, and to in effect give a kind of fine-grained look at what justice looks like in Durham. And she also wrote a really wonderful profile of our DA that I encourage you to look at. And I also want to thank her for agreeing to be our student introducer for our today's guests. So I will turn it over to Erin at this moment. Thank you so much, Erin.
Hi, Gunther. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to be introducing the panelists today. I'm an undergraduate studying public policy, and I spent last semester working for the 9th Street Journal and reporting on the criminal justice system here, including my profile on Satana. So today, our moderator will be Ajenai Clemmons, and she is a PhD candidate in public policy here at Duke with a concentration in political science. Her research focuses mainly on most important factors that help and harm the relationship between the police and community. In her research, she uses qualitative and quantitative methods to answer questions about how civilians assess police performance, and she compares policing of marginalized populations in the US and Europe. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in International Relations at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, and her Master of Public Policy from the University of Denver. She then served as policy director for a National Professional Association of Black state legislators in Washington, D.C., where her team kept members apprised of policy trends, helped them to exchange model legislation, and brokered meetings with members of Congress and the administration. Clemmons will be moderating the conversation with our district attorney, Satana Deberry. And Deberry was elected in 2018 as a reform-minded prosecutor and ran on the platform of creating a more equitable justice system in Durham. She grew up in Hamlet, North Carolina, and then went to Princeton for her undergraduate degree, where she studied sociology. Later, she came to Duke for her law degree and graduated in the class of 1994. She also has a master's in business administration from Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Throughout her career, she has practiced criminal defense law, served as the executive director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition. She also worked in nonprofit management with institutions like TROSA and Habitat for Humanity in pursuit of dismantling systems that marginalize poor people, communities of color, and underrepresented groups. Throughout her time as district attorney, she has made many changes, including a 50% turnover in her staff from the prior district attorney, Roger Eccles, and she focuses her office's resources on prosecuting homicide and violent felonies instead of low-level crimes like marijuana possession for personal use. She also implemented a pretrial release policy that enables people to get out of jail on a written promise to appear in court, limiting the use of cash bail, and all of this has led to a 12% decrease in the jail population. In a field where 95% of elected prosecutors are white and 76% are men, Satana Deberry is breaking the mold of a typical district attorney and because of this, she is well positioned to challenge the discrimination built into our criminal justice system. I'm honored to welcome all of you to this virtual conversation and excited to learn more about Deberry's ongoing work to reform the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin, for that kind introduction and for your stellar profile of the DA and the ND. It was wonderful to read. Thank you also to Gunther, Lolita, and Adam. It's been wonderful to work with you at Hart for inviting me to take part in this very special opportunity to converse with our guest of honor, District Attorney Deberry. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Paulus DeWitt Wallace and Sanford, and of course, every one of you joining us today. And finally, I'd like to thank DA Deberry for making this event possible. So I'm gonna begin by framing our conversation for the audience. The role of District Attorney is at the center of a great national debate in the United States because of its unique power to deliver both justice and injustice. On the negative side, we have seen DAs apply the law so unevenly as to be devastating for communities of color and for poor whites. For example, some DAs negotiate deals that shield certain perpetrators, particularly the privileged, from accountability. Others are quick to charge a defendant before the evidence even supports such a charging decision. Some DAs rack up as many charges as possible on the accused, far exceeding what the crime warrants in order to pressure defendants to take plea bargains. Some DAs overlook and even encourage unconstitutional policing practices, shoddy investigations, and serious misconduct in order to secure guilty verdicts. On the other hand, prosecutors can have an undeniably positive effect on their jurisdictions, from incentivizing their attorneys to prioritize truth over wins, to reinforcing constitutional and high-quality police investigations, to charging similarly for the same offenses, to seeking punishments that fit the crime, to finding mechanisms outside of incarceration that rehabilitate offenders and help restore victims. District attorneys have tremendous capacity for good, to right wrongs and positively influence individual lives, communities, and even public institutions as a whole. The fundamental question at the heart of our discussion today is, how can we construct a criminal justice system that centers dignity, equity, and justice? And so to lead us off in this first question, I said the question is, so the central question today is, how can we construct a criminal justice system that centers dignity, equity, and justice? The question that's going to lead us off today, can you hear me still? Is, what does justice mean to you, especially in terms of equity and dignity?
Thanks, Ajenai. That question is for me, or is it for the class? I'm going to make sure we're starting off.
Yes, for you.
Okay. Great. Thanks for having me here today, you all. I'm trying to work with me on the lighting here. It is not quite as light as it was yesterday when we practiced this, so I'm sorry for the low-level lighting. And thank you to Erin for that great introduction. It was really an honor to have her spend my first year as district attorney shadowing me. I think it worked really to put in the focus what we're trying to do, which is to make this job more transparent. I think just that alone creates a more equitable system. Often people have, they not only don't know who their district attorney is, they don't know what their district attorney does. And so one of our first goals in office last year was to create really an atmosphere in which the public understood kind of what the day-to-day role of the district attorney's office was, what our unique challenges were, and how we were trying to move past a system that really focused on the constant churn of, quite frankly, easy, low-level criminal cases, and was very much more focused on the complexity of violence, its role in our society, and how we hold people accountable for that. in a system that is really not focused on that.
Great. So our next question really wants to get at some of the successes you've had so far in office. So what are some of those successes, and how do you know, frankly, when they're working?
I think, it's a good question. District attorneys' offices are also historically kind of black boxes. There's not a lot of data. So when I started as district attorney, just some simple questions that we had, like, what does sentencing look like? How many plea bargains do we offer? What percentage of our cases are plea bargained out? What cases do we dismiss and what cases we move forward with? All that kind of data is typically not available in most district attorneys' offices. So it's hard to know where you started, and really we've been working with, we have some academic partners, Brandon Garrett at Duke Law School, Bobby Brown at North Carolina Central University, Fair and Just Prosecution, which is a national organization. We've been working with all of these groups really to create data points to understand what our office is doing. And so for us, our success, how do you take fair and just and translate that into how many murderers have been prosecuted this year, or what does the possession of low-level possession of marijuana, what does that equate to in the system? And so what we have decided, what we set out is, that's a big thing, but what we set out to say our successes were this year was, one, we knew that there were people in the Durham County Detention Center who didn't need to be there, who didn't pose safety risk either to themselves or others. And so our first goal was to really look at the jail population and only make sure that people who were a danger to themselves or others were detained pre-trial. So that has been, even before the issue with COVID-19, we look at the jail list every day. And every day we look at the jail list and say, who came in yesterday? Does that person need to be here? Or is that person only there because they can't make bond? Does this person need bond? Have they shown that they can't show up to court? So we created a new bond policy that for misdemeanors and low-level felonies, we assume that people will come to court. And so in those cases, the district attorneys, the assistant district attorneys will recommend release. And for those folks who are a danger to themselves or others, we have a hearing and the judges make those decisions. So that probably before March had resulted in about a 20 to 30% decrease in the population in Durham County Jail. Since COVID-19, we've looked at that even more strictly and said, okay, who's been serving time, who has been there pre-trial, who can have their cases resolved, so who can go to court, have their cases resolved and be moved on to safety, or who can be released. And I think we've now seen about a 50% reduction in the jail population. So we've seen that as success. We've seen our district court cases, which are low-level cases, traffic cases, misdemeanor possession of substances, low-level theft. We have seen those cases. We have moved more of those cases through the system. And what we hope we've done during this year is find resolutions to those that make victims whole when there are victims, and when there are not human victims, that we handle those cases more responsibly, meaning that we provide some kind of access to services for people that doesn't include incarceration.
Just a clarification question. Does that include diversion programs in any way, or are you using other mechanisms?
Right. So for cases in which there is no human victim, we try to divert those cases from court to the extent possible. So what does that mean? That means that if you are charged with misdemeanor possession of marijuana in Durham County, it is more likely that your case will, that you will be put into a diversion program, or you will have that case dismissed, depending on kind of your own individual circumstances. What we've tried to do is take an individual look at each case, as opposed to saying, we're just going to prosecute every case and move it through, and everybody's going to either get a conviction or go to jail. We've looked at each individual case, determined whether or not we should move forward with prosecution of that case, and either diverted those cases or moved them forward. And so what that means is that we have been able to focus more on violent crime. I inherited a caseload of about 100 unresolved murder cases. So those were cases in which somebody had been charged, but those cases had not yet been disposed of. And they dated back to 2013. And so in our first year, we moved about a quarter of those cases to resolution, whether that was by trial or by plea. And we resolved the oldest cases in the system as well. And so we, those cases from 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016, we have moved forward and disposed of those. And so we really have attacked the system from both ends, right? From the most violent to the least culpable.
Just to follow up on that point, that's remarkable. Were there any lessons learned from, having had those cases outstanding to be able to, start resolving those and attacking those?
Well, I think for the most violent cases, what we learned is not only do we have defendants who have been either sitting in detention, waiting for their day in court, we had families, right, and victims who also were sitting and waiting. And they would come into court sometimes every month, and nothing would happen. They'd get a call from the DA's office to say, hey, you need to show up, you need to relive perhaps the worst moment of your life, and anticipate reliving the worst moment of your life, and then we're not going to do anything about it this month. And you have to come back next month. And so what we found is that when we don't address the most violent cases, we really lose the support of the community, because the community's not worried that you're not prosecuting people who are smoking marijuana in the park. What the community's worried about is if they're the victim of a violent crime, they're a victim of an assault or a rape, or God forbid, they or someone in their family's murdered, that's not going to be taken care of either. And that is really where we have tried to rebuild the trust of the community, and the understanding that we care about what happens to the victims in those cases.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I want to move to the next question, which is, what do you think your office can do more of in order to promote justice, dignity, and equity?
I think what we could do more of is have more community involvement. Most people don't ever come to the courthouse. For most of you, if you have any involvement with the criminal justice system, there will be a traffic citation, and you'll hire a lawyer to come do that for you, or you'll come do it, and it will be inconvenient, but that'll be it. And so I think most people think that what's going on at the courthouse is the murders and the rapes and the arsons And the vast majority of what's going on in the courthouse is the low-level stuff. It's the traffic stuff, and it's low-level possession stuff. It's the prosecution of people who may have substance abuse issues, or people who are just poor, right? People who loiter because they're poor, or they steal because they're homeless, or they have substance abuse or mental health issues. And I think kind of long-term, we'd like to bring that a little bit closer to the people in the community so that they understand how court works, and why these Milwaukee, Wisconsin is a good example. They have these community courts in which court happens in neighborhood centers. It happens in community centers. So people see who really in their community is being prosecuted, as opposed to thinking that what's happening down at the courthouse is what's happening on CSI or Special Victims Unit or Law and Order.
To follow up on that point, so is it that you're kind of transporting the process from, let's say, downtown to a community, or is there something fundamentally different in the way that that sort of community experience is happening? Are there different components to it, different actors?
I think that just even the transporting of it makes it different. Court is a public process. You can always come down and watch court. Most people are not going to do that. The courthouse is intimidating. You have to park, and then you have to know where you're going, and you have to come through security to get into the courthouse, and then you have to sit in a courtroom where there's also security. And the whole thing feels very threatening. Even just the experience itself is threatening, even when the people being charged are not threatening, right? So the system itself gives you this sense that that really bad, threatening things are happening. When we can handle low-level things outside of that atmosphere, I think it puts it in the proper perspective for people, that these are absolutely violations of our social contract in which we want to hold people accountable, but we also don't think these people are threatening to our life and liberty. We don't want them smoking marijuana in the park because we've got kids and we don't want our kids to see that. We don't want people peeing in our front yards. We don't want people stealing from local businesses because that impacts their welfare. But we also don't think those are the most threatening people in our community. And so I think transporting that process itself helps balance that out.
Very helpful. And then let's move to our final question, and then we're going to bring in our undergrads. So you talked a little bit before about data being a challenge, or having been a challenge, and what you're doing to ameliorate that. But what are some of those obstacles to advancing your agenda? And in particular, what are some policy changes, maybe state laws, local ordinances, resources, data, that you would need in order to either eliminate or overcome those challenges you face?
I think one of the biggest and probably most challenging but easiest thing would be to have current technology. I think people would be surprised to find out that the court systems use MS-DOS technology. And for some of you, you are not old enough to know what a green screen is or have seen a green screen on the computer, but if you come down to the courthouse and try to look up a case, you will see a green screen. And so I have, young assistant district attorneys who come into my office who may have better technology at home on their personal computer than they have at work. And so the ability to even communicate with each other. North Carolina has a unified court system, so essentially every court in North Carolina should be connected to every other court in North Carolina. I should be able to find out if somebody who has a DWI here in Durham County has the same thing in Guilford County. It is a lot trickier to do that than than you would expect, especially in this time when we're used to getting on our computers and Googling something and finding something out in seconds. And so just even access to basic technology would be helpful. It would help us understand, it would just help us understand the environment in which we work much better. It would help us communicate much better. I think as far as policy change is concerned, I think actually paying attention to policy is a big deal. I think often district attorneys' offices are line ADAs don't have a direction in which they're expected to go. They don't get a lot of training to start off with. They just come in and have to go to court. You know, one of the, we don't have the technology that we need because the courts have been underfunded for a decade. Well, we also don't have the people we need because of that same underfunding. So people are expected to come straight in and go to the courtroom without having having any courtroom training, much less any idea what the core values of that office are or of that community are. And so the ability to really to create an office-wide policy and transmit that policy through our actions every day in court is a big challenge that we've been working on this year.
Thank you for that. So you definitely laid a strong foundation for the rest of our time here, having elaborated on your vision, successes, remaining agenda items, and some of the challenges that you face. And I do remember DAS. Wow, that was remarkable. Okay, so now that we have that context, I'm going to bring our outstanding undergrads into the conversation. They have done some fascinating criminal justice related research and have some recommendations for you. So I'm going to call them individually and have them share a little bit about their work and their recommendation for you. They'll take about 60 to 90 seconds to do that. And if you could kind of give brief reactions, that would be great. And then we'll follow up with a question from each of them. So I'm going to begin with Christian Shearer. Christian developed a 6-week pilot program to teach speech and debate to incarcerated youth in Florida's juvenile justice system, finding a positive impact on their views towards education. Christian, we're excited to have you. Please tell us more about your research.
Thank you so much, Ms. Clemmons. And firstly, I just want to thank District Attorney Deberry for your time today. It's been awesome to hear your insights. And yeah, like I was interested in debate education and how that might affect incarcerated students' attitudes towards education more broadly. So I worked with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice and developed, like Ms. Clemmons said, a 6-week pilot debate course in the Broward Youth Treatment Center, which is only about 10 minutes from my home, while I also traveled to other treatment centers in Miami-Dade County and across Broward County to kind of see the viability of expanding a debate education program within their facilities as well. And at the end of the 6 weeks, quantitatively, we found increases in student confidence in almost every category. We kind of tested, from information and argument retention to self-advocacy and affinity towards education more broadly. But personally, I think the biggest takeaway for me was learning intimately the ways in which these kids almost seem to be trapped within cycles of incarceration via like structural barriers, via geographic kind of like places where, you know, the only way out, it seemed, was to do something bad or get incarcerated, which inevitably leads down to incarceration later in life. So my question, rather than a recommendation to you, is what is your interaction with the juvenile justice system in Durham County? And how do you go about your work to ensure that children who may be caught up within the system, even if they're not incarcerated, they are the children of incarcerated people, are humanized and treated with dignity, such that they are not pushed into cycles of incarceration where they become a burden onto the community or they're trapped within structural barriers that lead them into becoming incarcerated later on in life?
Great, that's a great question. So one of the things that we know is that the number one indicator of your involvement in the criminal justice system as an adult is your involvement in the criminal justice system as a child. And so that is not just your own personal criminal justice involvement, that is the involvement of your parents or your guardians, or if you live in a community in which it is over-policed or people are over-incarcerated. And so here in North Carolina, we have just recently, well, North Carolina was one of only 2 states where 16 and 17-year-olds could be prosecuted as adults. And North Carolina routinely prosecuted 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. Just starting in December, North Carolina raised the age. Most 16 and 17-year-olds now will go through criminal justice system. And what we've been trying to do in my office, starting last January, even before Raise the Age took place, was that we tried to identify 16 and 17-year-olds, irrespective of where they were, whether they were in the adult system or not, and assign them to a juvenile prosecutor. And to really start to think of 16 and 17-year-olds and younger kids, obviously, as children. To assign them to a prosecutor who understood the particular ways in which the criminal justice system impacts the lives of children, and to really think about how we were going to integrate 16 and 17-year-olds into our juvenile justice programming, and then how we were going to handle them even when we did charge them in juvenile court, charge them in adult court. And so, we've had a real commitment to treating children who are under 18 as children. Now, unfortunately, right, we live in a really, an intensely urban environment, and we have 16 and 17-year-olds who are charged with the most, we do sometimes have ones who are charged with the most serious crimes. And so we have, that has been a challenge, but we also had a whole bunch of young people who had school-based charges or had just been charged in the community with things that we felt like weren't necessarily, they didn't need a criminal record for. So in addition to moving our under 18s to a juvenile prosecutor, and we also stopped accepting referrals from the schools. And so in the 2019-2020 school year, up until the unprecedented time that we live in now, we'd had 0 referrals from Durham Public Schools to the criminal justice system. And so that wasn't just my office saying we're not going to do that. That was us as a community deciding that we didn't want to participate in the school prison pipeline. That was the sheriff's office and the school resource office commanders being very focused on resolving school-based issues, DPS, juvenile justice, being very focused on resolving school-based issues as school-based issues, not by sending kids through to the criminal justice system. So we've been working very hard to create ways in which, and in North Carolina, if you are in the if you're in the juvenile justice system as a juvenile, you're diverted from the most harsh aspects of criminal justice, being detention, criminal record, and those type of things. So we've been working very hard to treat children as children and make sure that the mistakes, that mistakes are not highlighted and turned into criminal justice issues in the first place. And when there are legitimate criminal justice issues, that we treat those in a way that are age appropriate and set people up for success and not failure.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian, for that. We're going to turn next to Ajenai Clemmons. Ajenai analyzes decisions about pretrial release of defendants in New Jersey and compares judges' decisions to prosecutors' recommendations to them. And after New Jersey changed how it assessed defendants' risk, Ajenai finds judges more readily use these new guidelines than the prosecutors in order to exercise greater leniency in release. So would love to hear more about this, Ajenai.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Satana, for coming here. Last summer, I had the pleasure of working with one of the county offices of the public defender in New Jersey, where I'm from, and basically looked at New Jersey's 2017 bail reform law, which eliminated cash bail and then kind of replaced it with an objective risk assessment, which we called like a PSA. And I guess you talked about it a little bit before, and I think New Jersey's process is a little similar to how you've implemented it in Durham, where prosecutors can request detention hearings right after the person is arrested. And in New Jersey, at least, those hearings take place like about 5 days after the arrest, during which time the defendant is incarcerated. And so the prosecutor has this like incredible power of detention during that initial 5-day time in which there's no input from the judicial side. And they're kind of guided with that PSA and past criminal history and other risk factors. But what we found is that prosecutors are kind of moving to detain in almost 75% of cases in the county that I was looking at. But judges were granting detention only about 35% of the time. So there's like a huge disparity in that. And not only are the judges not granting the prosecutors the increased level of monitoring or detention they're asking for, but rather they're kind of reverting back to what the PSA guidelines and the Attorney General recommendations are. And so it was kind of like a big lesson for me in how much prosecutorial discretion can impact defendants. And so I kind of was hoping you can expand on a little bit about how Durham's pretrial detention process works, and what tools you guys use to evaluate risk, whether they're like objective or more based on prosecutorial discretion, and the work you're doing in that. Thank you.
Thanks, that's a great question. So we have kind of a lot of different things that are happening almost simultaneously here in Durham. The court system and the judges are working on a pretrial assessment tool. It is, and it's the PSA, which is kind of the gold standard that many jurisdictions are using now. Mecklenburg County uses the PSA, and PSA is a risk assessment tool. I am not a fan of risk assessment tools. I've been really clear about that. I'm not a fan of the fact that we are moving towards a risk assessment tool in Durham County, but I understand that that is, the judges want something around which to make their decision. I don't like risk assessment tools because you heard Aaron talk about my background. So I've done a lot of advocacy work over my 25-year legal career. I spent some of that time doing banking and consumer protection advocacy, and became very familiar with algorithms and how algorithms are used to determine risk and credit worthiness in the financial markets. And one of the things that I know about algorithms is that they are racist. They use, algorithm is only as good as the data that goes into it. And criminal justice risk assessments use historical data about who won't show up in court, who's most likely to not show up in court, who's most likely to reoffend. And all of that historical data in the United States is bound up in race and racial decision-making around who gets arrested and who's detained and who's convicted. So I'm not a big fan of that. So having said that, what does our policy internally at our office look like? So what our policy internally looks like is that we favor release, and my prosecutors recommend release in any case in which there is not a human victim. So in a case in which any case in which nobody's been assaulted or harmed, and so we try to here in North Carolina, well, here in Durham County, every defendant sees a judge within 24 hours of being detained. We have first appearance court every day. So they don't have to wait 5 days to have a decision made about whether or not they're going to stay in detention. Folks see a and on the weekends or overnight, they may see a magistrate who sets a bond, and then they see a judge the first opportunity within 24 hours after that. And so, kind of my office works under the belief that anyone who is not a risk to themselves or others should have a bond set. And that they should have a bond set that is a bond that they can make. North Carolina Constitution requires that everyone have a bond. The only people who the North Carolina Constitution contemplates should not have a bond are people who are accused of first-degree murder and are at risk of the death penalty. Those people under the North Carolina Constitution can be held with no bond. Everyone else should get a bond. We just favor cash bond, and we only favor cash bond in instances in which we feel like somebody is a flight risk. Because honestly, for some people, there's you can arrest Bill Gates and he will always make bond, irrespective of what you arrest him for. So we don't want to disfavor people who are just sitting in jail because they're too poor to make a bond. And so in instances where there's no human victim, nobody's been physically hurt, we default to asking for a written promise. And as you found, the suggestion of the prosecutor is very powerful. The prosecutor at that point is the person who has the information. And what we try to do then before we do first appearance court, happens at 10:30 every morning, is that we try to gather as much information about that person and their risk, their actual risk, right? So what their previous record looks like, what they're charged with, the condition in which they came in to detention, the officer's reaction, all those things. We try to get those things and make an actual decision based on that person.
Thanks so much.
I'm sorry, Sheila. I'm sorry. I'd love to
you're good.
but we need to move to the next student. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking research. Very well done. And I just, as a kind of quick time check, we do have a couple more students for you to respond to, and then we'll save some time for Q&A with the audience. So we'll move now to Kate Evans. And Kate analyzed state juvenile justice systems and finds a model in New Jersey's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative compared to other state systems. She finds that parole, reentry, and racial inequity needs improvement. So Kate, please tell us more about your work and your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I conducted a research project on the juvenile justice system in New Jersey, and I used surveys and interviews to gather insights from professionals. And ultimately, I think my report was able to combine a lot of conversations that were going on and kind of streamline the conversation about, okay, New Jersey's great at detention alternatives, but there's still a lot of work to be done on some of the issues that Ms. Clemmons mentioned, and also the equity associated with the availability of detention alternatives, as well as diversion programs. So New Jersey has these things called station house adjustment programs, which are diversion programs run by local law enforcement. And those are not equally available in all counties in New Jersey. So I think my report was able to kind of highlight where some of these racial and geographic inequities are most pronounced in the system. So I'd just love to know, DA Deberry, if Durham County operates diversion programs for juveniles charged with low-level offenses, and whether or not you think they're distributed equitably across the county. And thank you again for being here. It's been great to hear your insights.
Great. Yes, Durham County. So North Carolina operates, juvenile justice in North Carolina is essentially a diversion program. So any juvenile who has a petition taken out against them has to kind of show up for an interview with juvenile justice, and juvenile justice will then interview them, decide if they have resources available to address that child's particular needs, and then may assign that child to that diversion program without ever referring it to my office for prosecution. So that should be happening everywhere in the state of North Carolina. Additionally, in Durham County, Durham has a misdemeanor diversion program, which it's now been expanded beyond juveniles, but it started out as a juvenile diversion program that gives kind of individual officers the opportunity. They have a general order from the chief that says, hey, if you pick up a juvenile who is engaged in behavior that you don't think is dangerous necessarily, you can divert that person to the misdemeanor diversion program. So you give them a citation that sends them to the Criminal Justice Resource Center, where they may be evaluated to see if maybe they have a substance abuse problem, if there are other ways in which they can be connected to services in the community, and then they are also diverted from court. They're asked to do some things. If they do those things, then the case goes away and never gets referred for prosecution.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. All right, our last presenters are coming to us from Thea Dowrich and Sydney McKinney. You know, the previous proposals dealt with levers of power that were far more directly within your wheelhouse. This next proposal, which focuses on the rights of formerly incarcerated persons, stretches us a bit perhaps in terms of your direct control, but certainly you can exercise the power of the bully pulpit, influencing people's opinions and perhaps even changing the terms of the debate. So Thea and Sydney identified barriers to re-enfranchisement for the formerly incarcerated and have some recommendations. We'd love to hear more about your work.
Hi, thank you so much. So my partner Thea and I have been working this semester to identify concrete steps that can be taken to decriminalize the ballot box in North Carolina. And we've narrowed down our focus to two components of decriminalization. The first being fines and fees, and the second being an intent statement. So removing the prerequisite that formerly incarcerated individuals must pay all fines and fees associated with their incarceration before they are eligible to vote, as well as adding an intent clause, because there are a lot of formerly incarcerated individuals who attempt to vote and don't understand that they're not eligible or haven't completed all of their requirements and then are charged with voter fraud. So making sure that when people are being charged that there's a burden of proof that they must show that they were aware of the fact that they weren't eligible to vote and it wasn't just an issue with dissemination of information. And so we are composing a reform bill and helping with that to be presented to the North Carolina General Assembly later this year in hopes that those two clauses will be passed. And my partner Thea has a question for you.
Yeah, so going off of what Sydney said we're looking at decriminalization of the ballot box. And so our question for you is what steps are being taken in Durham to decriminalize the ballot box?
So Durham has a really active second chance community. So I guess I would say, as far as fines and fees are concerned, and I probably should have talked about this when we talked about the successes in our office. One of the things that we've done over the last year is forgiven about, has worked to put before the court criminal justice debt and have that criminal justice debt forgiven. So we have, at this point, worked with our partners to forgive about $1.5 million worth of criminal justice debt, whether that be whatever kind of fines and fees that may be. We've identified 15,000 folks in Durham County who criminal justice debt was keeping them from moving forward, whether that be getting their driver's license returned or having their full citizenship rights restored. So we've been working on the fines and fees piece. We have not yet had any referrals to us for ballot box fraud. So that would be something that, if something like that were to come before us, certainly in my office, that would be something that we would have to investigate and take seriously. It is my belief that you do not have to, once you have paid your debt to society, you should not continue to have to pay your debt to society by continuing to be under the burden of fines and fees or continue to suffer the loss of your citizenship rights. And so certainly we wouldn't want to do anything that further restricts those citizenship rights from folks.
Great, thank you so much, Thea and Sydney, for your work. Now we're gonna turn to some audience questions. Those have been coming in to Adam, and then Adam is forwarding those to me. We'll begin with our first question, which is, if you could talk a little bit more about how your office might decriminalize and increase supports for victims and survivors of sexual and domestic violence.
Sure. So one of the things that I did when I took over was reorganize the office. And this was with an eye towards not just the training of staff, but really the understanding of the work that we do. And one of the things that I created was a special victims team. The special victims team handles kind of what you historically would think of as special victims cases, which are victims of sexual assault, but it also handles domestic violence cases, and it handles homicides to the extent that the victim was targeted because, well, if the homicide was a result of domestic violence or sexual assault, or the victim was targeted based on their race, nationality, sexual orientation, or gender presentation. And so what that means is that we now have people in our office who are specifically trained around dealing with victims of sexual assault, dealing with the trauma around being a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence, understanding that those cases are not straightforward, that you can't just always expect a victim to come right in and be willing to testify or even be willing to talk about what happened to them. And so we specially trained our ADAs and our victim witness assistants and legal assistants to work with those cases. We've also been working with DPD and the Sheriff's Office on the testing of sexual assault, the backlog of sexual assault kits. And we have identified through that some serial sexual assaults that hadn't been prosecuted, and are really taking those cases seriously from the very beginning and working with victims long-term on those.
Thank you. We have a question about sort of your office's relationship to other DAs in North Carolina, and this can happen on both a sort of formal and informal level in terms of partnerships, but how do you all influence each other, and have you seen any sort of success in having an influence over other agencies or vice versa?
Sure. So there are 43 district attorneys in North Carolina. We have a unified court system in North Carolina. So essentially, we all have the same job. We all represent the people of North Carolina. So I am statutorily mandated to be a member of the North Carolina Conference of District Attorneys, which means I am in essentially a professional association with every other elected district attorney in North Carolina. So we meet regularly. Our budgets are tied to each other. The folks who work in my office are state employees. We're funded by the state of North Carolina. So I work with the other district attorneys around budgeting issues, understanding what we need from the courts, and making asks to the General Assembly. I don't know, to be quite honest, I don't know yet what my influence is on them. I think that, I think we've seen it through this COVID-19 process that many of them are working to decrease their jail populations. And I think they will, and I think that has been a direct result of our work. They've seen through our work that it has not made our community unsafe or dangerous. In fact, it has stabilized many neighborhoods in our community that otherwise would have been unstable, and so has encouraged them to think about their jail populations during this time and think about who is safe to release. And so we'll see how we influence them long-term on other matters.
Thank you. We've gotten several questions in, but I'm just going to ask this last question. And what we'll do is thank you, DA Deberry, for so graciously being willing to stick around until 1:15. For folks who still want to be able to chat a little bit afterward, we will officially wrap up in just a few moments. Let's take this final question, which is, it's kind of a philosophical question about what is your view of prisons and the role of jails, excuse me. But if you want to kind of parse that out a little bit and talk about, are there ways in which we should be thinking about the role of jails in our society, and maybe new ways to move forward?
Yeah, wow. So philosophically, I would say when I started, as I was running for district attorney and as I've started district attorney, I am not an abolitionist. And one of the things that I have seen as district attorney is some pretty horrible things. There are people who are legitimately the victims of horrible crimes. And so I think we have to, as a society, have some accountability for that. But is that accountability our current jail and prison system? I don't think so. I think that we over-incarcerate the wrong people. I think we put the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who have the least access to economic opportunity, to mental health services, to full participation in our society. I think we jail those people rather than help those people. And so I think philosophically, we have to decide who the real criminals are, right? And if we are going to hold people accountable, are we holding people accountable for the things that they've done, or are we punishing people forever? And I think that is a fine line, and it is really difficult when you're in the system and you kind of every day as a prosecutor, I see people in their absolute worst state, right? And so that's for me, that's every day. Every day I see people on their absolute worst day. And so that has some real impact on your psyche, right? You start to think of just everybody, like the world is bad because every day all I see is bad. And so I think we have, as a system, we have to take a step back from that and understand that just because we're seeing people on their absolute worst day doesn't mean we throw them away. It means that we figure out how we hold people accountable in the system when they have violated the social contract, when they have committed violent acts against each other. And then for those people who have done something else, like people who are just poor or vulnerable or sick, how do we reconcile them to our community? How do we create systems and how do we create the opportunity for them to participate in society? And how do we create the opportunity for those people who are coming back to society? How do we not punish them forever? How do we reintegrate them into our society? To me, I think this system creates a tremendous amount of waste of human potential. Some of the smart over this last, 15, 16 months as a district attorney, some of the smartest people, some of the most compassionate people I've met are returning citizens, right? They understand that they did something wrong. They fully expected to be held accountable for that. And they're the first people who will accept accountability when they violated the social contract. They also understand, they're also smart people, and they also still have things to give us. And so how do we get that from them? How do we let them fully participate in our community as full citizens once they're home?
What a powerful note to end on, restoration. And thank you so much for that. I want to close out. I think I'm going to turn it over to Gunther just to totally close us out in a second, but I definitely want to give a big thank you to you at home, across the country and across the globe. I think Thea is where she is I think 2 a.m. in the morning, 2 a.m. So across the globe, we are joining today. Thank you to our undergrads, to Hart and our co-sponsors. A gigantic thank you to you, DA Deberry. And particularly now when we look around and see so much injustice, it is deeply inspiring to have a model that we can emulate of someone who has practiced courage long before now, who has practiced courage both on behalf of others and who has had to practice courage, frankly, just to be herself, the person she is in order to become the leader we needed you to be. So thank you so much. And for those who, Gunther, I'll turn it over to you just to close us out.
Well, Ajenai, you said it incredibly well, and I should say, if we do have a few more minutes for people who want to continue the conversation. I do just want to echo the thanks, especially to you, Ajenai, for helping facilitate such an extraordinary conversation, and really for shaping this process throughout. And I think I do want to say a shout out to the students whose work inspires us at the Hart Leadership Program, who ask questions that are hard. And our students have a stomach for conflict and for looking at what seem to be intransigent problems and finding new ways of asking and finding hope. And I'm encouraged by them at this moment especially. So I want to thank the students and those who are not represented here, because we have lots of students who are continually helping us think about what justice means creatively. And of course, to DA Deberry, thank you so much for your leadership and taking the time out of a busy schedule to be with us, to be the educator that you are as well. And to be, I should also say, to be willing to be vulnerable as a leader is itself speaks to your strength. So thank you so much. Thank you to Lolita and and to Adam, my amazing colleagues in the Hart Leadership Program as well, who really shaped every bit of this. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ajenai. If there are additional questions, we can continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gunther. We can let everybody hop off for a few seconds. I'll just pause, and then we can. I'm not sure if you heard me, but we'll just let folks jump off and pause for a moment, and then we can get to some of these questions that came in. All right. Sounds like they slowed down a little bit, the exit. So want to ask you a little bit more about restorative justice as an alternative to incapacitation. A couple people wrote in about that.
Yeah, so we have been working on a restorative justice program, a more formal restorative justice program in Durham County District Attorney's Office. So for folks who don't know what restorative justice is, it is a victim-led process in which we know as prosecutors, sometimes as representatives of the state, we represent the people of Durham County. I'm not necessarily the lawyer for the victims. And so often victims will say to us, they did not get what they needed, right? So as the prosecutor, I make the decision on what the eventual outcome of the case is, what the plea bargain is going to be, whether the case is going to move forward, whether the case is going to trial at all. And sometimes victims want something different. Sometimes victims will say, a lot of times victims want to say, I want to know why you picked me, right? And you know, the dirty little secret of the criminal justice system is that victims and defendants are often members of the same community, sometimes members of the same family. And so they want to know why you did this to me. And so restorative justice, sometimes it is combined with a criminal justice outcome. So sometimes it's part of a plea bargain, or sometimes it's done as diversion, but really it's done to give the victim the opportunity to address the person who did them harm and ask for what they need to repair that harm. And so we have been trying to create a more formal process in which we can do that, and in which we can hopefully restore for some of our victims their sense of safety, as well as their sense of community. And to give defendants, oftentimes defendants are just, you know, there's not a lot of opportunity in our process for victims and the defendants to talk after something has happened. And, you know, often defendants have great remorse for what they've done. Sometimes they don't have great remorse, but sometimes they are really, they really have things that they also want to say too. And so the restorative justice is a facilitated process in which the victim gets to ask for reparations and for their harm to be repaired, and for the defendant to offer that reparation, and in the hopes that folks get that we repair some of the harm, and create kind of the more beloved community, I guess, as we move forward.
Thank you for that. I want to share this fun comment. Where did it go? It says, thank you. This was really, really excellent. I'm a first-year law student and needed this after a semester of crim. Not a question, just a thanks. That's great. All right.
I understand.
You're like, I feel your pain.
I feel your pain. Yeah, 25 years later, I still feel your pain.
Wow, that's really saying something. All right. Okay, question about expungement. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what your office is doing around expungement and driver's license relief?
And so, those are two separate things. So
Right.
driver's license restoration, we made a big push towards driver's license restoration with our partners in the city of Durham, our nonprofit partners, North Carolina Justice Center and Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Process actually started before I was the district attorney. City of Durham was looking at ways. City of Durham has this thing called the innovation team, and they were looking at ways in which they could make life better for folks in Durham. And they were looking at trying to create a jobs program. And one of the things that they found out was, I'm trying to say this real quickly, was that 99% of the jobs in Durham County required you to have a driver's license. And there were some really large number of people in Durham County, like 50,000 people who didn't have a driver's license. Most of them were people of color, and that a lot of them didn't have driver's licenses because they had fines and fees from previous traffic citations that hadn't been paid. And so part of our fines and fees forgiveness work has been working with people who have old criminal justice debt. You know, I think when we first started this, some folks hadn't had driver's license, had driver's licenses since like 1987, 85. I think 85 was the oldest one that we had done. You know, and give you some idea how long ago that was. I graduated from high school in 1987. So, you know, we felt like, again, this goes back to when have you suffered enough, right? So to live in a southern city where there's hardly any public transportation and not be able to get a driver's license is a tremendous burden and a tremendous barrier to inclusivity and economic opportunity. And so the same is true of a criminal of having a criminal record. You know, I had a conversation early on in the campaign with the manager of a really hip, trendy hotel downtown, and he said he got a lot of criticism for not hiring local people, but you know, he's part of a multinational, and you know, people apply online, and if you got a criminal record, when you apply online, the algorithm, back to the algorithms again, spits you out. So he never even sees you, right? So it's not like, you know, 30 years ago when you could have gone into the manager of the hotel and said, hey, you know, I got into some trouble when I was younger, but I'm older now, I've learned from that, give me a chance, and he could give you a chance. He can't give you a chance. And so we started to realize just how really impactful a criminal justice record was for people long-term. Even your credit report, right? Part of your credit report is built on what they call community statistics. And within those community statistics are some criminal justice statistics. So if you live in a community that has a higher rate of incarceration, your community statistics will lower your credit score, even if you yourself have not been involved. So we've worked with our partners around doing expungement clinics. Right now, the law is in flux in North Carolina. We're hoping that the General Assembly will expand the number of expungements that we can do. But I think we're now at hundreds of those that have been done in clinics, and we've done about 70,000 record expungements through the DA's office, through just cleaning up old files and dismissing old cases.
All right, I know I want to stick to time here. I have one, this looks like it's quick, so we'll just take this one last question. It is when you talked earlier about the community courts, maybe some more information about where you got the idea from, who's supportive of it, where would they be located? Maybe not like the weeds, but just kind of big picture.
Yeah, that's a lot. You know, there are community courts all over the country. There's some in Milwaukee, there's some in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Brooklyn. Lots of communities are fine. There's some in Charlotte. Durham has done truancy court in the community. So we have examples of having done it here and to a limited extent. And so if we, to do those things, I think there are lots of places here within the community centers. We have a great network of those here in Durham where we could do those. We could do those in churches. We could do those in school auditoriums. We have a lot of, Durham is a good sized city with a lot of public space and a lot of opportunities to use that public space for something else.
Excellent. Just wanted to give you this opportunity to have a final word. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Any ways that they can get involved?
Yeah, so I want to thank you all, even for having me participate in this. Duke has been a great partner over these last 16 months in the research and the work and the policy. And as a Dookie myself, I want to really encourage all you students to, you are the future. I was you 25 years ago. And if you told me then that I'd be in this space, I probably would have paid more attention and done a little bit more work. But I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you. And we are always open to working with students on their projects. As you see, by the introduction, Aaron worked with me for a whole year. Ajenai and I worked together previously even to this on a project. And so you can reach out to our office. The best person to reach out to is Sarah Willits in my office. She can make the connections if you want to do a project. But you can also follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram, on our webpage, follow us on Twitter. There are lots of opportunities to work with us on creating new programs and helping us track data and create policy and getting the word out about how we can do this system differently. And we'd love to have you work with us, and we appreciate it. And thanks to Gunther too. I didn't thank Gunther.
I see Gunther popped up. Thank you so much, District Attorney Deberry. Gunther, did you have anything you wanted to say before we all pop off?
Just thanks again. Great conversation. And I hope there'll be more follow-up and opportunities because there's such good work being done in this incredible city we call Durham. So glad it's home.
Thank you both.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody. Take good care.
Bye.